Hey everybody, Saul here. I wanted to make a video, kind of a follow-up to a previous video where I asked the question, where are or what happens to the Sasquatch bodies after one of them gets shot? And one of the answers in there that is, an obvious possibility is that the government comes and takes these bodies and takes them off to do who knows what. Um, I'm going to make a longer video on my thoughts about that, but I wanted to give a little bit of context and a situation that happened to me here that has nothing to do with Sasquatch, but kind of gives a little bit of insight into, some of the things that could be happening out in the country that may not make it into the news, so to speak, that just kind of basically stay hidden. So several years ago, we had some guests down at the lower end, people staying in our campsite that has nothing to do with Sasquatch. And one of the guests worked for the federal government, um, was involved in environmental work. And, people who are environmental professionals that do restoration were always my favorite guests, simply because they understand, what I've worked so hard to do out here. And we had this great check-in, I was probably spent an hour with them down by the river, walking around talking and just having a great time. They were just some of those guests that you just, it makes it worthwhile what you do, everything that you put into this place that people come here and appreciate it. So I wrap that up. I come up to the top here, let them get on to their weekend and all that. And I sit down in my trailer and I start hearing this gunfire. And it's just like bam, 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 bam. And it keeps going. And I'm like, holy smokes. Like, I'm just, kind of riding on the high of having this really solid interaction with someone who, I immediately have a certain amount of respect for. They're telling me what their job is. And I seem to be, impressing them. And they're really having a good time, which is why I do what I do. And then all of a sudden, here's all this crazy gunfire. And I'm like, oh, okay, I don't know what's going on. It's not any kind of hunting season. I haven't been hearing any gunfire lately. And it just keeps going. It winds up going for about 45 minutes of just pretty much like nonstop gunfire. And it was coming off the river. Okay, so I'm sitting there thinking they've got to be culling birds, right? So we have double crested cormorant on the river, and I think there are other species that they will cull. Um, and they'll bring in contractors and get set up out on these artificial islands out in the Columbia and just take out huge numbers of birds. And so I started calling around. The first place I start, of course, is at the local level because they might have the information right there. I've gotten other calls from people in the area, etc. So I tell them what's going on, because the other thing that happened was there was the sound of the gunfire, and then there was this weird plane sound. I don't know what was going on, but it was almost like the plane was like circling and then coming in, and then it would kind of like, and then it would take off again. I mean, it was completely unlike anything I've ever heard out here. And so I asked the county, I talked to the county sheriff. I'm like, okay, there's an, incredible amount of gunfire and something going on with the plane out here. What is this? And they're kind of like, well, we don't really know, but, I'll tell you what, we get these calls from people like you and we don't know what to tell them and we have no information. Basically, he was saying, stuff like this happens. It's coming from higher up somewhere in the government. They're not told a thing down at the bottom. Their job is made more difficult by people like me calling in because, again, the sheriff kind of knows these things happen, but they can't tell us anything. And so they just wind up fielding these calls and telling us, nothing. And so then they start, okay, I go, I know how the chain of command works in the government and whatever through, eh, eh, environmental bureaucracies and wildlife and all this type of stuff. And they start sending me up, and I keep going up and up and up until I finally am talking to somebody at, like, I can't even remember for sure. I apologize, but it was like the Forest Service law enforcement division or whatever, the federal law enforcement up in Seattle. And I never heard anything back. Okay, well, a little while later, of course, this is such a small area that they have this little blurb in the local newspaper that essentially they put 911 calls on there, and most of them are like, oh, emergency calls, someone screaming in a house on whatever road, or there's a cow in the road. There's a lot of those out here. But mine, they put mine in, and they basically made me sound like a crazy person. I can't remember the exact verbiage, but they made it sound like I was just some crazy guy out here on the river who was imagining hearing a battle of some kind out on the river. And I'm like, okay. So the first call I make is the sheriff. He tells me, yeah, we know stuff goes on, but we can't tell you what because we have no idea because they don't tell us. I start calling up, go up the chain of command. Nobody can tell me anything. Then it comes out in the newspaper that I had made this call and they just mock me. Even though, there should be a paper trail if that sort of thing is going on, right? Like I'm calling all these different wildlife managers. If they're having a culling that's that big, I mean, usually those are even in the newspaper. Like if they're going to come out and kill like 18,000 birds, there's environmental groups, there's all sorts of people involved. The state, federal, local agencies are involved in a process like that. That's what I was looking for, and I couldn't find it. I just found nothing. So that's basically what happened to me in that situation. One last tidbit: I had told this story to an individual that came out here to do a little bit of work for me. And he told me that one time he was doing some work out in Long Beach, and that, he was going around to find where he was supposed to do what he was supposed to do or whatever. And he accidentally stumbled into this room, and he opens the door, and there's all these some kind of like special forces people. They're armed, dressed in black, all this kind of type stuff. And he's just like, okay, and quickly leaves. And I think he said, they said, hey, you need to keep quiet about what you saw here or whatever. Okay, who knows what that was? I mean, there's a whole host of law enforcement agencies that could be doing work out there that, maybe it has to do with drug running or something that is just, completely different. My point is that there are times out here that there are things happening that are exercises. They could be exercises, they could be real, actual operations, taking out people who mean us harm. I mean, all sorts of things. And we don't necessarily know, and they're not going to let us know. And so that's just kind of some context I wanted to provide before I get into a little bit more about, what I think the latter would be, how it could actually make it up in the Department of the Interior, as far as like a Sasquatch body. But even just for something mundane like this that is clearly happening, this went on for 45 minutes. Even there, they just have to say, no, it didn't happen. And guess what? It didn't happen. And I'm crazy in the newspaper. So, all right. Thanks for tuning in.